which is setting the stage. So as Hilal mentioned, we'll have 40 minutes for each paper. And our first paper is that by Adam Chilton and Bartek Woda, and it's titled The Design of BLAs. The second paper of this panel will be Yuval Livnat and Hilal Shamir's paper, Bilateral Labor Agreements. Who are they good for? What are they good for? And without further ado, Adam and Bartek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me first off start by saying thanks to Hila and Tamara and everyone involved in organizing this conference. I've been so impressed by everything over the last year as the conference has gotten organized, and especially given all of the additional and unforeseen hardships that Hila started by mentioning. But I'm extremely excited to be here today and have all of these people talking about BLAs. There's this statistics that I really like that I reference a lot when talking about BLAs, which is that there's been an explosion of research in economics on poverty reduction. And so, for instance, several of the most recent Nobel Prizes in economics were awarded to poverty research that is focused on programs on how to bring people out of extreme poverty in places like in India or Bangladesh. But the best evidence right now is the very best poverty reduction programs that we found and we've been able to document are 40 times less successful than simply allowing a poor person to move to a richer country to work. So the importance of figuring out ways to facilitate the movement of labor is absolutely essential to reduce poverty. And beyond that, I think beyond just the poverty reduction angle, it's critical going into the future, given declining birth rates in much of the developed world and China as well as the disruption that we're going to see from climate change. Figuring out the legal ways to facilitate the movement of people is just a first order problem for development, poverty, climate change, etc. But despite that fact, the studying of the legal channels for international migration is nowhere near on the top of the agenda of academic topics and simply receives incredibly little attention. Now, that's why I'm excited about the conference and also the background to the paper that Bartek and I are working on for the conference. So the context for our project, and to let me explain it, is that in 2015, 2016, into 2017, Bartek, Eric Posner, and I started trying to just find bilateral labor agreements and to document what we could. In 2017, we released the results of that. And at the time, we had a data set that referenced, I think, 582, maybe, something like that, BLA. Sort of documenting these 582 BLAs, we were able to collect copies of about 300 agreements. We then, after publishing the first paper on that, Bartek and I started writing a paper studying the Philippines BLA program, in part because they sign a lot of BLAs and they care a lot about labor migration, but they also keep great administrative data on all of their labor migration. And through that process, we had this experience where the BLAs that the Philippines government had listed online and the BLAs that we had previously been identified was not the full list. And after we spent time in the Philippines working with the various government agencies, they said, well, that doesn't include X BLA, and no one referenced that BLA. And actually there were 2 signed this day, or whatever it may be. And so the real number that the Philippines has signed is 68, where we previously knew about 42 or something like that. So, about a third were missing once we actually got to work with the government agencies in the Philippines. So what we decided to do is to say, all right, we need to go back to the drawing board, take the data that we had, another data set that Maggie Peters, who I haven't seen Maggie join yet, but she's presenting here later this week, also put together, and whatever we could get our hands on, and try to come up with a more authoritative list is piece 1. 2 is that we realized we're unsatisfied having only not as many copies of the actual agreements. And in instances where we can't find copies of the agreements, we at least wanted to save and document proof that they existed. And by that, I mean, in our old data set, if a BLA appeared in someone else's data set of international treaties, we'd include it in the data set, even though we ourselves had never gotten evidence from the country that it actually existed. And then the goal that we're trying to work towards, that we've unfortunately made less progress than we had hoped by the start of this conference, is to actually have RAs code the contents of these agreements based on compliance with the ILO model agreement. All right, so that's the background on what we've done. We've been going through these existing data sets. Bartek's going to tell you about where we are now, and then I'm going to tell you about what's next in the data collection effort for this summer. All right, Bartek.
Okay, so I just have a couple of figures that also appear in the paper that summarize the state of our data set so far. So as of today, we have 1,061 BLAs in our data set. Figure 1 here shows you the cumulative number of BLAs signed over time. So of our 1,061, 2 were actually signed before 1945, and by 2020, we have the 1,060. If you look at this figure, there are sort of 2 inflection points. There's a steady growth of BLAs until about 1975, when at which point the global economic crisis leads to a slowdown of new BLAs. And then in 1990, they start being signed at a much faster rate again. The dashed line below shows you the unique number of country dyads, that is country pairs, with at least one BLA. And that line sort of has the same slope as the total BLA line, but much lower level. In fact, suggesting that on average, each country dyad signs 2 BLAs over time. Figure 2 shows the cumulative number of countries that have signed at least one BLA. There's a similar pattern here with steady growth until 1975 or so, and then a plateau until about 1990, at which point more countries begin to sign BLAs as well. And figure 3 breaks this down by region. And there are some interesting patterns here. So the dashed gray line shows you countries in Europe with at least one BLA. And you can really see that the early phase of BLAs in the 40s and 50s was driven by European countries. These are largely Western European countries such as France, West Germany, Belgium, Italy, the UK also signing agreements with countries on the periphery of Europe, or Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, Greece. And this was largely driven by the need for post-war reconstruction. And then Europe sort of stagnates in the 60s, 70s. And then in 1990, there is a rapid addition of new European countries as the end of the Cold War leads to the creation of a number of new countries in Eastern Europe, as well as greater sovereignty for formerly communist countries like Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, that are now signing BLAs with their sort of wealthier Western neighbors. Another interesting pattern is in Africa, so the thick solid line here. Most of the countries that are signing new BLAs in Africa do so in the 60s and 70s. These are primarily North African countries like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, that are signing BLAs with their former colonial powers, most notably France. And finally, Asia, there is a sort of steady growth of new BLA signers until about 1993 or so, at which point a lot of new countries start signing BLAs. Many of these are relatively lower income countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, like India, Bangladesh, Philippines, signing BLAs with Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. Those countries recruit workers from the poorer countries in large numbers to be able to construct infrastructure and so on. Figure 4 gives you a map of countries with the most BLAs signed. You can really see here that Western European countries have signed by 2020 the most BLAs in general, as well as Canada and Australia, although I should say that the Canadian and Australian BLAs are not your traditional guest worker program BLAs. They're what is called working holiday BLAs, which are quite different. The lowest BLA signers are the sort of low-income countries in Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, with the exception of South Africa, and the sort of lower middle-income countries in Central Asia, with sparse populations. Figure 5 summarizes that information in a bar chart. So you can see that by 2020, about a quarter of all countries have never signed a BLA at all. That's this bar here. And then an additional 15% have only signed exactly one BLA. 28% or so have signed more than 11 BLAs. That's these two bars here, with just under 5% signing more than 50 BLAs throughout their history. Figure 6 compares some of the BLA signers with non-signers on some country and diet level characteristics. So each dot here is a standardized value of the variable on the y-axis compared to BLA non-signers. So for example, this graph tells you that countries that sign BLAs tend to have higher GDP per capita, tend to have larger populations, and higher employment population ratios, but lower annual hours worked. They also tend to be more democratic, as indicated by the higher Polity 2 score. And
Bartek, if I could ask you to start wrapping up.
Okay. So one last thing that's interesting is, perhaps not surprising, is that countries that sign BLAs tend to be close geographically and closer politically. Last two slides very quickly, some more information about the actual documents we've collected. So we have evidence, our copies for at least 75% of all our BLAs, and most of them are in English with a couple in German, French, Spanish, and Arabic. Okay.
All right, let me add just one more sentence. We'll stop. Apologize for being over time, which is, so this is incomplete because we are still finishing this data collection, so these numbers could change, but also, as I mentioned before, there's many of these BLAs that are just hard to find, and so they're going to be sort of systematically incomplete. The other thing is we've got funding and RAs for the summer to code the contents of the agreements that we have copies of. We're coding them based on the 29 provisions of the model BLA that LO put out. One thing that we wanted to get feedback from in this room, as we're starting that process, if there are other variables or things that people in this room would want to know about the BLAs that would be relatively easy to also code, we're open and interested to knowing what other information people would like to know about them. All right, I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is a great opening for us to start the discussion. So I was so excited I didn't introduce you properly. So I will say only that Adam and Bartek are both from the University of Chicago, and their respondent is Avinoam Cohen from the College of Management and TraffLab. Please, Avinoam.
Thank you. Maybe if you can stop sharing slides, if possible. All right. Hi all. So thank you very much. Thank you, Tamal, and thank you, Adam and Bartek, for this paper that I'm delighted to have an opportunity to delve into and think of the details that you provide and of this project. So the paper opens an aperture to a broad project that is in many ways, I think, the foundation of the work and much of the conversation that will follow today in the next few days, and also, of course, grounds for empirical work that can unearth trends and processes that cannot be viewed from the distinct piecemeal process of regulating migration through BLAs in specific migration corridors. And the importance, I think, is also not only in the positive findings, but also where conventional truisms do not find support in the panel data that you already generated or will generate. I think it's already evident in one of the interesting findings that you note towards the end of the paper in Figure 6, that the GDP to trade ratios of countries that did not enter BLAs are actually similar. Or to put it bluntly, that BLAs are not indicative of the degree of economic globalization that the ratio is conventionally related to. So, and as we've heard, I think that the attempt to map the involving contours of what Holyfield termed already, I think 2 decades ago, the missing regime, is compared to the global regimes that liberalize the movement of goods and capital. And you mentioned this in the beginning of the paper, and it's almost necessarily frustrating. And I would suggest that this is due not only to the secrecy and related problems, but also to the segmented view that that the BLAs offer on transnational migration. And in what will follow, I will add a few questions that follow up on this. And I think that I hope that will be relevant both to the next phases of this paper and this project, and I think also to broader questions that we are all grappling with in this or another way. So the paper, as I read it, belongs to a scholarly effort to provide a coherent and systematic account of the legal underpinnings of global policy domains, and specifically of the mobility regimes of capital, goods, and migration that make up globalization. Its force is in the broad coverage and the provision of data that bridges the paucity of writing in the field and opens up a new field of investigation. And since I think we can expect this paper and this project as a whole to be a formative contribution of the field, in the field and of the field, I think it's important to look also at the assumptions and the boundaries of the project, what's included and what may be left out. I think that also speaks to the question of coding that I will address in a moment. So I want to focus on 3 questions and say a few words on each. The first is, what's the function of BLAs in the evolution and structuration of migration regimes, and how the data set can contribute to its understanding? Specifically also, thinking through the relationship of other border liberalizing regimes in the triad of people, goods, and capital. And the third question is, can BLAs contribute to thinking of this emerging space if it is still partial and segmented as it may be, as being not necessarily fully congruent with the national sovereign domain and its inherent methodological nationalism, that is, the assumption that states and state policies are the only or the main natural category of analysis. So I'll say a few words about each of these questions. The first on the function of BLAs in context. So the project provides an important layer to understanding the legal architecture of international migration. But it also implicitly describes BLAs as a policy measure that can be treated discretely. But we know also that alongside BLAs, receiving and sending states entered free movement regimes, the EU, the Mercosur. There are some very minimal GATS Mode 4 commitments, mostly to high-scale migratory routes. States also resort to broad regulatory repertoire that is unilateral, driven by a complex mix of political economies that often lead to a frustration of explicit immigration policy goals. So the first question is, what is the function or role of BLAs in this broader picture? So of course, this question goes beyond the paper, but what I think does relate to the paper and the specific project is the work of researchers that looked at that tried to code immigration policy data. So I'm thinking of the IMPIC, Impala, and mostly the DEMIC project of De Haas and collaborators. So the work that showed that immigration policies turned especially from 1945 onwards, not more restrictive, but more selected. So if we translate this into the BLA field, maybe there's a difference between BLAs that allow preferential selection in closed border regime, or BLAs that create paths to new immigration, as suggested by Land Pritchett and others. And I think, Adam, you made reference to that in the opening of your presentation. So I would urge you to expand the empirical models to situate BLAs also in broader migration regime and migration policy context, and not keep it as a discrete regulatory measure. That is question and maybe comment number one. The second is to think of BLAs in the context of the other two liberalization regimes, that is trade and capital. And I think, Bartek, you mentioned that in your presentation that BLAs cover mostly guest worker programs. That is mainly migration to the sectors and professions that cannot be outsourced, that where trade and investment is not replaceable with work. And I think it is interesting to think here in this context on this finding that there is no there's no significance, or there seems to be no significance to the extent to which a BLA countries engage in or are open to trade. And perhaps a more nuanced look here at the segmentation of labor markets is relevant. That is, what are the sectors to which immigrants come in or are sent to in the context of BLAs, and also in receiving countries, the degree of segmentation of labor market, wage disparities, coverage of collective agreements. So these questions that can tell something about the impact of trade on an internal labor market are maybe also relevant to understanding the role of BLAs in this context. And to keep short, a third question also, I think it's also, and that I think is a forward-looking question, is can BLAs contribute to thinking of this space, as I said, as not congruent fully with the national domain? So are there indicators, for instance, of non-state actors' involvement, or at the national or transnational level, that are intertwined in these processes? The role of can the role of IOM, of regional consultative processes, of different actors at different levels be indicated in? Can we see them in the, will the coding flesh them out, or can we see them in the context of BLAs, thinking of BLAs as representative of the international domain? And here I think my thought about this is that the migration studies literature tends to collide BLAs to see BLAs as part of the state national repertoire. And I was wondering if the work that you are doing can potentially see that it's not only a state venue, but also something which is above the national domain, with its own intrinsic logic and similarities to other international domains created by international lawmaking, as in the context of trade and investment. So these are three questions to plot into this project, and just to repeat what I began with, that I think will be because I think it will be it will seem that it will be the definitive contribution opening this field. I think that plotting to its boundaries is very important on this stage. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Avinoam. I'll just correct first the message I wrote on the chat. If you'd like to raise your hand, apparently it's under the reactions tab and not under the participants tab. So I already have one hand. But let me revert to Adam and Bartek first to respond to Avinoam, and then we'll take the additional comments, please.
Thank you for that comment. To save time for discussion, keep this brief, but I do think that these are important points, and specifically what was the first point on how do BLAs intersect with the sort of broader set of regulations and laws that regulate migration, including things like freedom of movement in the EU or in the Mercosur, or countries' domestic migration policies, some of which are negotiated in relation with other countries. One piece of this that we've still done an unsatisfying job of and would be helpful to come out of this conference is a set definition of what constitutes a BLA. In that, for instance, trade agreements, preferential trade agreements like the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, includes references to allowing workers related to the movement of trade to be allowed to move between these countries. I don't know if NAFTA is a BLA or not the way we've been sort of really focused on these documents that are just about moving people. But I think that as there's more of us working in this space, we need to think about how to define what it is we're trying to study, and that as the comments made clear, we actually really haven't still done a very good job at trying to bring in these other things to figure that out. I'll end there though, but thank you for the comments.
Terrific. Please, Alan Hyde.
Thank you very much, and thanks for this conference. This entire topic is something that floats through my seminar on global labor rights every so often, and the thought enters my mind that that I really should look at this systematically, and I never have. And I'm very, very glad that all of you are doing it together. A narrow question and a slightly broader question. First, on this definitional point that Adam just raised, does your definition of BLAs include the Social Security agreements that are the subject of the Olivier paper? Other things that might be added, the U.S. Free trade agreements with Singapore and India include some very specific commitments about visas, and I don't know if that's a labor agreement, but it's some kind of an immigration agreement. The second question is my longstanding obsession with the idea that in this field, as in so many others, personnel is policy. Around the world, we see migration managed by government officials who are located in ministries of labor, development, foreign affairs, pathetically in my country, Homeland Security. It would seem prima facie that managing migration through a bilateral labor agreement would involve more participation by individuals located in ministries of foreign affairs and perhaps less in other government agencies. But that would be normally a good thing, in my opinion, certainly in my own country. When anything you can get moved out of Homeland Security into the State Department, you're already making significant progress, such as refugee resettlement. So I'm curious whether there's any way of watching or coding the administration of BLAs in terms of the local agency involved.
Thanks, Alan. So to respond to the specific comments, so I think currently, although Bartek correct me, we haven't included other treaties that include migration commitments as part of the BLAs that we're looking for. And I think that that's out of, I guess to be blunt about it, perhaps laziness instead of a good principled reason. In that what we've tried to do is find like the treaties on the movement of workers and to make that our focus instead of like looking at the set of international treaties and then code whether or not there's mentions of workers within those agreements. And so I think things like the US PTAs that include visa commitments or social security agreements, et cetera, I think we've largely not included, but in the data that we've collected, and which is an undercount without a great justification. On the second point that Alan raised, is there a way to code the administration of BLAs based on the government agencies involved? I both think that this, if possible to do, would be an important thing to do, and is also a source of a lot of the complication with BLAs. So I already referenced this, but Bartek and I have been working on studying just the Philippines and have gone there and visited the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Labor, the Department of Statistics, a range of different government agencies. And they all have sort of overlapping jurisdiction over these things, and they don't work super closely together within the different agencies of the Philippines governments. And so there were BLAs that the Department of Foreign Affairs told us about that the Department of Labor didn't even seem to know about, or at least had been forgotten in different ways, and vice versa. And I think that's part of the complication, is that these are often documents that are signed during diplomatic visits or events, et cetera, that might be negotiated by the Department of Foreign Affairs, and then that aren't really well translated into policy, or they're translated in an incorrect way, or whatever it may be, which I think leads to the secrecy of the agreements that we're going to hear about, perhaps some of their limited impact. This is something that we didn't mention, but our research on the Philippines suggests that their program may not have had a very big impact on migration or remittances. And in part, that's to do with the way that they, I think, are administered. All right, I'll stop there unless Bartek wants to jump in.
Yeah, just to add to the answer to the first question. So when we work with our RAs, we ask them to look at BLAs very broadly and basically include any agreement that governs the movement of workers across borders. But trade agreements specifically, I don't think we have any actually in our data set.
Okay, excellent. So we now have a long list of hands and only 5 more minutes. So let me take, I'll read one that was sent to me from the chat from Surat Musika Wong, who's one of our participants. And then I'll revert to Jennifer and Marian, and maybe you can answer all 3 together in the interest of time. So Surat, and I will be reading, she said she was curious if authors or others could discuss how labor BLAs are also utilized in terms of international diplomacy, trade in arms, and national security technology, and how labor BLAs is not singular in its utilization. It's not a single issue kind of treaty, if I understand correctly the question. And now to Jennifer and then to Marian.
Great, thank you. So I'm a little worried that the questions are gonna all be of the form, Adam and Bartek, now that you're doing this fantastic project, could you add in the things I want to know on top of all the things you're already studying? So I, in advance, apologize that this is one of those. And so my question is about picking up on Avinoam's point about the other actors involved. As I read the papers for the conference as a whole, excuse me, one of the things I would say sort of in summary is that BLAs, if you're asking about how effective they are in protecting the rights of migrant workers, they're much better as to recruitment costs than they are as to the protections of rights on the job, right? And so that leads me to want to add to your list, which BLAs have trade unions and other workers' organizations as actors, and does it make a difference? Right, that doesn't make a difference, I understand, is beyond the scope of the kind of coding you're doing now. But if you coded for that, then some of us could pick up on the does it make a difference question. So I just wanted to put that on the table. Thank you.
Terrific. Marian Pennison?
Yes. Hi, I really enjoyed the paper, Adam and Bartosz. I wanted to pick up on Tamar's question at the outset about the graduate trainees or the internship and young professional agreements. So for example, in Swiss immigration policy, these agreements are not considered labor migration because they do not change national Swiss immigration legislation. But nonetheless, under WTO law GATS terms, especially if these young professionals or trainees work, they're in a hybrid category, as Tamar also mentioned. So they consume educational services, and in that sense, they fall under the GATS, and sometimes they also work. If they work, of course, in a services industry, they fall in 2 ways under the scope of GATS. And in that sense, it raises MFN issues, but it also implies a certain affinity or closeness to labor migration. But I really think, in addition to studying trade agreements, it would be really interesting to do something with these yet uncategorized categories of graduate trainees, internship agreements, stagiaires, and whatever they're called. So it's just an addition to research. Thank you.
Okay, we have more questions, but they'll have to wait. So one last minute for you to respond if you'd like to. And I invite anyone else to just write directly to Bartek and to Adam with their questions, please.
Great, thanks for these questions. To just go in order of the three. First, how do BLAs fit within diplomacy and within national security? So I think that I previously studied bilateral investment treaties, and a large part of the story of the diffusion of bilateral investment treaties is secretaries of states, presidents, prime ministers would sign these things at meetings when they would have a conference or a state visit or whatever, and no one really paid any attention to them. I think that part of the story with BLAs is that many of them seem to be documents that are around diplomacy instead of the sincere effort to establish new guest worker programs, and finding out how to disentangle and see which are these things and what they are is, I think, important to be able to study them, and what works and what doesn't is to understand which are the sincere efforts to actually increase migration and which are the sort of general statements that will take care of workers going forward. And that's a good thing to focus on. Second, response to Jennifer's question. I really like the idea of looking for the role of trade unions and other workers' rights groups. I wrote a book last year with Mila Versteeg on constitutional rights, and our sort of main headline takeaway is that the thing that really matters for the protection of constitutional rights is organizations that are dedicated to enforcing those rights. And so it makes perfect sense to me that things like workers and trade unions would be critical for BLAs actually having concrete impacts on the rights of workers on the job place, the protection of their rights, the protection of their wages, et cetera. And that does seem like a really promising direction to go to look for what's effective, and we should look into coding it. Final question on the graduate trainee programs and other internship programs and how they both relate to BLAs, but then also how they might be regulated by the GATS or other trade agreements. I think the idea of what's the relationship between signing a BLA and MFN commitments under trade agreements or other policies is totally interesting, and something that needs more attention. In that, as the question made clear, it's quite possible that some of these agreements could potentially run afoul of MFN commitments under the GATS or other provisions. But to date, I think there's been just such siloed thinking about migration and investment and competition law or whatever it is, that the interplay between these things, I think we're not done there. All right, I'll go ahead and finish there, although there's more to say, but I recognize we're already over our time. Thank you so much for the feedback and the comments.
Thank you so much for starting us off. This was also a great discussion. Invite you all to ask questions and join the